Welcome to the Clutch Kitten Gaming Podcast, where I play an indie game for 5 hours and let you know whether or not it's worth your time and money. Hello and welcome everyone. This is James, also known as Clutch Kitten, and I am so glad you guys are back for episode 15 of the podcast. It really feels like forever since I've been back, but I think that's only because we did a different format last week. If you haven't gotten to listen to my conversation with Zach, definitely try and carve out an hour while you work or you game because I really think you'll enjoy it. We touched on a lot of topics during conversation, including how difficult it can sometimes be to tell people that you're a gamer. We also created our own game by choosing a character, weapon, world, and genre, which was a ton of fun. I chose the Doomslayer as my character, the energy sword from Halo as my weapon, Columbia from BioShock Infinite as my world, and I believe Zach and I came to the consensus that a first-person shooter would be the best genre for that game. If you haven't tried this out for yourself yet, you should totally do it, and then send me in your selections to clutchkittengaming@gmail.com. I'm really interested in seeing what elements of the games you like would be incorporated into this game that you made. Really quickly before we move into this week's story, I want to mention that we have a new 5-star review on iTunes and 2 new 5-star reviews on Podchaser. I don't have names for any of those, but thank you very much if you're one of those people. It helps a ton to have 5-star reviews for the podcast, so if you haven't done that yet and you enjoy the show, go ahead and consider writing one of those up. If I somehow missed your review, feel free to shoot me an email and let me know as well, because I definitely miss those sometimes, and I want to have a chance to thank you for that. So what's been going on in the world of gaming over the past few weeks? One piece of news that stood out to me was the Google Project Stream that launched. This isn't the game streaming like with Twitch, but streaming like OnLive if you ever used that back in the day. Instead of downloading a game to your computer to your hard drive, you stream the game just kind of like you watch Netflix. If you go to projectstream.google.com, you'll see that they're currently selecting people to test out the streaming software by offering Assassin's Creed Odyssey for free. I haven't gotten to the program yet, but all the things I've heard have actually been pretty positive so far. What's going to be interesting is seeing what Google can do with this streaming tech, because one of the big difficulties of game streaming is that internet speeds often cause latency issues in games. That isn't a big deal for some games, but it's really an issue if you're playing like a fighting game or a game that requires really quick reaction. Latency is going to be a worse boss than the boss you're fighting in the game. So definitely keep your eyes peeled for what happens with this Project Stream and go try and sign up if you haven't done that already. Let's jump into this week's game. Today's game is called Dead Cells, which is a rogue-lite, Metroidvania-inspired action platformer. It's rogue-lite in the sense that there's permadeath, meaning that once you die, you have to start a new run over from the beginning. And there are both permanent and temporary upgrades. The Metroidvania distinction is important because unlike many roguelites, which prefer the top-down style of dungeon running, such as Binding of Isaac, Dead Cells takes a Metroidvania approach which uses 2D side-scrolling and incorporates a large interconnected map that you as the player can explore. Dead Cells was released in early access starting on May 10th, 2017, but the actual 1.0 version wasn't released until August 6th of 2018, so very recently. It was developed by Motion Twin, which has a studio based in Bordeaux, France, and who's been around since 2001. What's interesting is that prior to Dead Cells, Motion Twin primarily created online and mobile games such as Die Tonight, Mush, and Upper Cup Football, and Dead Cells actually started out as a tower defense game and eventually morphed into what it is now, which is completely different. I thought that whole story was super interesting. Dead Cells costs $24.99 on Steam, and there are no microtransactions. According to HowLongToBeat.com, the main story of Dead Cells takes around 12.5 hours to beat, but a completionist style takes upward of 55 hours. I can totally see this happening because there's a ton of weapons and items to collect. The game has a ton of replayability, as we'll get into later. When you jump into the game, you're allowed to play with keyboard and mouse, but the game recommends using a gamepad. When I saw that message, I ended up using my Xbox 360 controller, and it felt great to use. Let's move now into the story of the game. You move along the ground, and the cold bites at your form. Darkness is around you as you head through the sewers, around a corner, down some stairs, and finally, you spot a body. Is there a head? Thankfully, this poor soul was recently beheaded by the executioner. Bad for them, but perfect for you. You've been given many names in your time, titles like the Prisoner and the Fallen One, but the one that seems to strike fear in your foes the most is the Beheaded. While you contemplate this, you possess the body, reanimate its bones, and pick up the sword nearby. You run for the nearest door, you run towards the castle and towards the king. There is something wrong on this island, and all you know is that you're driven by the urge to seek out the king and make him like the body you now possess. Dead Cells is set on an unnamed island in a time period filled with magic, swords, and bows. The game is also filled with a wide variety of creatures and locations. There are levels in the sewers, in the castle, in the small village, and many more places. And with each comes a plethora of strange creatures to defeat. Despite there being many unique creatures, there really aren't a lot of primary characters. The first is obviously you, the Beheaded. Your soul is some sort of grayish-green piece of matter with a gem at the center. You're immortal, and you choose to inhabit headless bodies to pursue your goal of killing the king. Besides this, not a whole lot is known about your character other than your sense of humor. You have no voice, but there are small sections of dialogue where your character gestures to indicate a lot of different emotions. Sometimes you'll shrug, and sometimes you'll give a thumbs up. It was actually so funny because when I saw the Beheaded gesture like that, it broke my immersion in the game at first. After a while though, those gestures actually began to build the personality of my character and gave some much needed comic relief. The feeling of the world isn't overly heavy or dark, but there are times where a run would get incredibly tense, and those small moments helped to break that tension. Besides the Beheaded, the other primary characters are the bosses. Without getting into too many details about them, there's the following: the Concierge, Conjunctivius, the Timekeeper, and the Hand of the King. Full disclosure to you as listeners, I'm currently about 5.5 hours in, and I still have only beaten the Concierge. There is a ton of depth to this game, and although there's only 4 bosses, there's a lot of content to go through and a lot of learning to go through as you play it. So how do you receive story elements? If the crux of the story is as simple as defeating the king, how does the game help build the narrative? The primary way you learn about the world is through stumbling upon rooms or interesting scenes while you explore the map. You might go to a room with some potions and read about a discovery some character made, or you might stumble upon a man with an arrow in his head and read the warrant for his death. Besides these small scenes that give a little bit of background into the world, most of the world building is done through how you as the player observe the locations you go to and observe the enemies you face. As you probably guessed right after I said the words roguelite, the story is not important to Dead Cells. The humor shown by your character and those small scenes give you a glimpse behind the curtain, but beyond that, the game lives and dies on its mechanics. The world that Motion Twin created is beautiful, and I did feel like I was in this mystical place. I just didn't have a whole lot of lore or story to support that feeling. Since the mechanics are core to this game, let's jump right in. There are 2 primary things you're going to be doing. You're going to be doing quite a bit of exploring, and you're going to fight a lot of enemies. Once you pick up your starting weapon or shield, you run right into the first stage, the prisoner's quarters. From there, you fight your way through enemies to find the exit. What makes a Metroidvania-style platformer unique in comparison to other platformers is the way each level is laid out. If you've played a traditional platformer like Super Mario World, there's a very linear path to the stage end. You start the stage and run to the right until you reach the finishing gate. In contrast, when you enter a stage in Dead Cells, you're meant to explore the area. You're often presented with choices in where to go. Do you want to climb some platforms and see what's up above? Do you want to take an elevator underground and explore down there? Do you want to see what's down this weird looking well? In the case of the prisoners' quarters, you'll eventually find one of two doors at the end of the level, one that leads to the toxic sewers or the promenade of the condemned, but you don't have to exit the level until you choose to or until you die. The exploration in Dead Cells is incredibly fun. Each stage is procedurally generated, but they don't feel that way. Sometimes the levels in games with procedural generation can feel sloppy or awkward to go through, but the developers of Dead Cells did a great job of setting up the parameters for that generation so that the stages felt deliberate but different each time. Instead of worrying about finding my way to an exit, I could enjoy the fun of exploring a different configuration of the map, and I never felt frustrated with that exploration. One worry I had coming into the game was that there would be a lot of backtracking. One inherent issue of the Metroidvania style of level is that backtracking is almost always necessary. You can imagine these maps as mazes. Some directions you go have cool loot and secrets, but they're dead ends and you have to retrace your steps in order to get to the primary path. Thankfully, Dead Cells really addressed the issue of backtracking. They remedied this issue with a teleporter system. At pretty much every branching path in the map, there's a teleporter which allows you to jump to any other activated teleporter in the stage. This made it so that I could follow a random direction, knowing that I wouldn't have to waste a lot of time if it was a dead end. The last thing I want to talk about in relation to the exploration is the timed door system. There are quite a few secret locations which require certain runes or special abilities to unlock, but there is generally one door in each stage which can only be unlocked if you are fast enough in the prior stage. Behind these doors is a stash of coins and cells, and usually a weapon or a scroll. For the Promenade of the Condemned, I believe the run timer has to be under 2 minutes or something in the prisoners' quarters, or that time door locks. What makes this system so interesting is the decision you have to make as a player about how you want to proceed in your run. If you take your time fighting through a level and exploring every nook and cranny, you forfeit the loot behind the time door, but you might get way more cells, scrolls, coins, and weapons by exploring. It's a decision you have to make, but it's nice because if you don't want to spend as much time exploring, you can still be rewarded for that playstyle as well. Let's quickly talk about the progression system and then we'll get into combat. There are two currencies you're going to get in this game, gold and cells. The gold you get from killing enemies and finding loot can be used in run to do things like purchase better weapons if you find the shopkeeper, upgrade your current weapons, or open doors which can only be unlocked with gold. Cells, on the other hand, are the currency you use to purchase permanent upgrades. You can unlock new weapons, abilities, and powers only through cells. The interesting thing as well is that you don't have the option to unlock all the weapons or abilities from the beginning of the game. For many of the items, you have to first find the blueprint in a level, survive until the end of that stage, and then spend the proper amount of cells on it to unlock it for future runs. I actually really liked the permanent unlock system in Dead Cells. Finding blueprints felt special, collecting cells felt important, and the entire system gives you as the player a slow but consistent stream of new weapons and abilities to use. That, in addition to a huge variety of weapons and procedural generation of levels, lended to the game feeling different on every run you did. So what's the combat actually like in this game? Some people actually call Dead Cells a Souls-lite game due in a large part to the combat. If you're not familiar with the Souls-lite subgenre, it's referring to the Dark Souls series, which are incredibly difficult and punishing games. Similar to some of the Souls games, Dead Cells has punishing but very satisfactory combat. An imperative skill to the game, if you want to progress, is to learn each enemy's patterns and how to counter them. There's a green jewel enemy that's pretty harmless until it does a powerful charge. There's an enemy that throws targeted bombs which explode after a second or so. There's a swordsman who will teleport right in front of you before doing a devastating slash. What's fun is that the combat in this game almost turns into a dance. You learn how to exploit each enemy's weaknesses, and if you do it properly, you feel incredibly powerful. The dance also changes up depending on the loadout you have. You're able to carry 2 weapons and 2 recharging abilities. I am so far from unlocking all the weapons in this game, but there are already some incredibly fun ones to use. The weapons range from double daggers, which do a critical strike on your 3rd hit, a bow which shoots 2 arrows, and a whip which tosses out a grenade every few seconds. There are also shields, giant swords, and so many more weapons to use. On top of all these weapons, there are also tiers of strength for each weapon. As you get further into a run, you'll find better versions of the weapons you already have. It's insane. The variety of weapons is awesome, but what's even more amazing is that each weapon feels and plays differently, and your loadout will drastically affect the way you need to position and which enemies are a threat to you. In addition to your 2 weapons, you also get to carry 2 abilities on cooldown. These abilities are things like grenades and turrets, which can also change your playstyle a ton. At first glance, Dead Cells might look like a simple side-scrolling hack and slash game, but once you start playing, you realize that it has an incredibly nuanced combat system that is honestly unparalleled by games in the same genre. Although I could go down the rabbit hole of weapons and systems so much further, let's step back and look at the gameplay loop as a whole. You enter a stage where you explore and fight and find the exit. In between stages, you receive an upgrade and you can spend any cells you collected and then move on. You then go to the next stage and repeat with more and harder enemies, better weapons, and new secrets. Although most roguelites have a very similar grindy gameplay loop, Dead Cells creates an immense amount of variety, which took me out of that grind mentality. This game has such an enticing gameplay loop. We've made it past the bulk of the game, but let's not forget art and music. Again, we find ourselves with a 2D pixel art game. I really am a broken record when it comes to this, but the pillars of my comparison are Celeste and the Red Strings Club. How does Dead Cells hold up against those 2 games? The art for this game is pretty nice. There are some vibrant colors, unique landscapes, and very cool animations. The part of the art that was somewhat lackluster though was the dead space on stages, so the space where your character can't go. There wasn't a ton of detail to it. The detail would start and then fade out into a dark blob of color. It's a very small critique, and honestly it's one to be expected since the levels have random generation as opposed to the handcrafted stages in Celeste, but it was something that was noticeable nonetheless. Overall though, the art was great. The music hit a similar note for me as the art. It added a great ambiance and it made me feel a sense of intensity in the levels, but it really wasn't the most memorable. If I was to rate both the music and the art, I'd probably give them 8 out of 10. They were good. They were just not insanely good. We've made it through the narrative, mechanics, art, and music, so now it's time to summarize the positives and negatives of Dead Cells. On the positive side, I was first off impressed by its stellar combat. It really did feel like a dance which had enough variety to fit any playstyle you could want. If you want to play aggressive and fast, grab some daggers and grenades. If you want to play safe and slower, grab some turrets and a bow. The enemies also aided in creating an ever-changing combat environment. Secondly, the exploration aspect was a ton of fun. I was actually a bit worried about the Metroidvania inspiration when I first came into the game. I didn't want to backtrack a lot, and I didn't want to get frustrated with the random generation of huge levels. Thankfully though, neither of those became issues, and the exploration turned out to be exciting and exhilarating. The addition of time-gated doors also lended to a risk-reward feeling as you went through each of the stages. On the negative side, not a whole lot came to mind. The primary aspect that was lacking was obviously the narrative, but I didn't feel cheated out of a story. Roguelite games are typically focused more on mechanics, and Dead Cells was no exception. The lore of the universe was not deep, but it was good enough for me to feel immersed in the world. We've made it to the final boss. This is the part of the podcast where I let you know whether you should slay the game and buy it, flee the game and avoid it, or farm up and wait for a sale. My consensus is to slay this game. If you've had a difficult time getting into the roguelite genre, or even the Metroidvania genre, this is the perfect place to start. And if you're already a huge fan of both those genres, this is also perfect for you. This game will provide you with a ton of unique and fun gameplay, and is definitely worth the pickup. As always, thank you so much for listening in. This podcast would not be around if it weren't for all of you fine people taking the time to support me and support the show. If you're wanting to keep up to date on the show and what's going on, don't forget to keep an eye on my Instagram and Facebook at Clutch Kitten Gaming, and my Twitter at KKG Podcast. Another way to support the podcast is just by listening like you're doing right now. Also, if you really enjoy it, go ahead and tell a friend about it. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you guys in game.